Hello, Yakri here with the new Shrine of the Eidolon patch. That's patch 22.13.3, the one where we got all the beam weapon changes. Now, unfortunately, I do not have any before and after footage because I didn't expect these to come down quite so fast. I didn't have time to record it with my beam weapons, which is unfortunate. But, on the upside, the changes are, as DE said in the patch notes, so significant that comparing the old weapons to the new weapons would be like comparing apples to oranges, at least stats-wise. So, I'm going to show you the Amprex, the Synapse, and the Atomos. Mostly because these are the weapons that are beam weapons that I actually bothered with before beam weapons were buffed. And this patch is a massive buff for the majority of the beam weapons changed, possibly all of them, just because of how they changed the beam weapon mechanics. And I will be showing off these weapons against level 125 enemies, and they're all quite effective against level 125 enemies now. And perhaps before the Amprex may have been, but the other two weren't. Although the Atomos is a very good weapon when damage boosted, on its own it wasn't too great against high-level, heavily armored enemies. Even with corrosive damage, it was how to put it, if it fell off fairly hard, but it was an amazing, like, mid-tier weapon, right? And now it's pretty effective versus these guys. On the Amprex and Synapse are fantastic now. Although Amprex somewhat more so than the Synapse, just because it chains attacks, and this is a horde shooter, and that's really good. So I'm gonna bore you for a little bit longer with me just standing here. I want to talk about what they did at least a little bit to beam weapons. They weren't 100% clear on it, but essentially beam weapons now ramp up to perfect accuracy and high fire rate. Or let's see, limited range and damage. Yeah, okay, so they ramp up in range and damage, excuse me. They start at 10% and they go up to 100% over 0.8 seconds. So it's very fast, almost impossible to notice, right? And they also trace their shots like twice per second, I think. No, it's not twice per second. It's a little bit different, but they take 0.5 ammo per shot, essentially, right? So when you have an ammo count like of 70, like the Synapse, it's a huge amount of ticks. It's 140 ticks of damage that before you run out of ammo. So these are all very high ammo weapons now, right? And because of this, you can get a lot of status effects with these weapons, right? They've also, in general, adjusted fire rates up, base damage is up, and things like critical chance down for most of the weapons, except for the Atomos. And although it is better, I felt a little like it was a little unfortunate that they went the route of giving it a little bit of like occasional crit to balance out its damage rather than base damage. But whatever. Okay. So, this only has 18% status chance. However, it's going to actually end up being quite frequently because of that fire rate of 15.6. And because previously with beam weapons, they had status per second, and it resulted in relatively poor status chance, actually. Compared to something like a machine gun, like the Supra, they had very poor status. And in fact, now, even 18% status chance is actually pretty decent with how quickly they fire. And especially when you have a little bit of punch through, you can get a huge amount of status procs, especially with the Amprex, which has a better status chance, and we're going to show that off a little later, and it's pretty crazy. The Synapse additionally got a bonus, although you can't red crit with it nearly as easily. It did get a bonus headshot crit damage multiplier, and I believe a buff to its actual crit damage, right? In addition to these changes to how beam weapons work. Well, let's just jump into this to show you what I mean, because DE themselves did not describe it very well, in my opinion, and it's kind of hard to get to grips on what this actually means in terms of weapon damage. And so if we just aim for the head here, we can get pretty amazing damage on these Ard heavy gunners, right? It'll ramp up, you'll notice, even after I've been firing for a while. Of course, when I pick a new target, because I am corrosive procking them, and after the first few corrosive procs, your damage goes up significantly when fighting high armor enemies, right? And it just chews right through these guys. I don't have a before video example, but it was not nearly as good before the update. You didn't get as many status effects, certainly, and it didn't do nearly as much damage. And it was kind of useless, even though I had two extremely good Riven options for it, even with them, and I've got them taken off, as you saw on the weapon screen earlier, to show off, you know, for those of you who don't want to waste your time, like, picking up Rivens for niche weapons and spending a bunch of fucking Endo and Kuva rolling them, which I assume is most of you. Yeah, it's still a pretty good weapon, right? There we go. Alright, so enough of that. This is quite effective versus these guys, as you can see, and it wasn't before. The Amprex as well, I must say, did considerably less damage before this, even though it can no longer red crit without a Riven mod. Or I guess Argon Scope you could use, but I don't think Argon Scope is particularly DPS efficient with this weapon, right? The Amprex is even more dramatic because it hits multiple targets. Overall, it makes it one of the best beam weapons in the game because of the damage arcing. It's just a really fantastic mechanic to have. Oh, and I don't even have this. I forgot to switch builds. This is actually a gas proc mod, so it's a neat thing you can do. Well, since it now has amazing status chance, right? You can mod it to have gas damage, and it's going to arc between targets, creating gas clouds, which will often, and it doesn't really happen in the simulacrum, but in around the real world, if you have a high density mission, it will much more often hit groups of enemies, right? And as you can see, it's taking some work to get through these guys, but if I actually, you know, roar, and if I had any sort of, I don't know, with roar it actually cuts through the main target pretty quickly. Anyway, the gas procs also can crit, right? And I have Hunter Munitions on here, which means that my gas procs cause AoE slash procs, which, unlike the gas procs, are actually effective against high-level enemies that are heavily armored. Now, let me show you the build I was using and then switch over to a corrosive damage build, which will actually be a lot better than this. So this is what I was using for the gas procs. This is more of a, if you're bringing corrosive projection, this is pretty good. If you are, what's the word I'm looking for here? Fighting lower-level enemies, this will just incredibly quickly clear a room. That's what this is good for. And we can switch over here to the corrosive build, right? That's just straight corrosive damage, 35% status, and it has a similar fire rate to the Synapse, right? So that status, 35% status, as you saw earlier, the Synapse was getting a pretty solid amount of procs. Of course, it's a bit inflated by the fact that I'm using Hunter Munitions, but even with only 18%, it was getting that large number of procs. And you could, I believe, build this for even more procs than I've got it built for. But as we can see here, it's just going to ramp up really quickly and eliminate this group of heavy gunners, no problem. Some of them are going to actually no longer have armor from all of the corrosive procs I'm getting, right? Just absolutely great weapon, and it couldn't really do this before, right? And I think maybe it doesn't have it now. On one of the builds I had electric damage on the side, which is kind of nice. I don't here because I've got corrosive, right? If you have that electric damage on the side, of course, it can arc and stun enemies, which is actually fairly nice with the amount of enemies it can arc to, because electric procs arc in a 5-meter radius around them, right? And they'll stun everyone that they arc to. I think they can jump up to like 5 targets within that radius or something, right? Well, you have a chance to proc that status for every target that the Amprex naturally chain lightnings to, right? As part of one of its base mechanics. So since you can do that, you'll end up what's the word I'm looking for here? Electric procking over a very wide area and stunning a huge number of enemies and substantially decrease the amount of damage on you, which isn't really the case with a lot of other weapons that can electric proc. You usually only hit a few. You don't really hit enough enemies to make a huge difference in the amount of incoming DPS. Although, it exists, right? Now let's take a look at these guys versus the Atomos, another weapon that I don't think, in my opinion, wasn't really cut out for these kind of enemies, not without a damage boost anyway, although I was quite fond of using it against them with a damage boost like Chroma. And it actually just shreds these guys really well with its it chains between 5 different enemies, so even though it does not quite have the same amount of DPS as those other weapons, I don't think, although it's hard to just eyeball it. I'm gonna have to wait until a Warframe builder catches up on these new changes. I don't think it has yet. But yeah, it cuts through them pretty effectively. It's actually, this one is particularly surprising because they cut the base damage of this weapon by like 48%, right? Huge drop in the base damage. However, its hits per second is just so much higher that it doesn't matter. And with the increased ammo efficiency, its sustained damage has not decreased. So overall, quite good. And since it procs more status effects, this means if you mod it for corrosive and take it up against high-level enemies, its damage is increased significantly more than it is on paper. compared to previously, especially because status per second with its, I think its status chance was buffed, and then status per second is a shit status, like was a horrible, it made any amount of status per second you had horrible, basically, by definition. Okay, so this is kind of a short video on these changes. I would call it an overview. I don't have a ton of other well, I do have a decent number of other beam weapons, but I don't have them modded out in order to properly test them. So it's going to be a while before I can do any other videos on different beam weapons. I will say the ones I've shown you here are fantastic, and I expect that at least with a little bit of what's the word I'm looking for here? Gusto, something like that. Enthusiasm. You can make most any other beam weapon that has been touched by these changes at least decent as well. Perhaps with a Riven mod for the shittier ones. I frankly expected the Synapse to need a Riven mod to really be good, but you actually do not, as I showed earlier. And if you do, its Riven disposition is, what was it? If you do want to, you know, I for one kind of like collecting Riven mods, especially ones for less popular weapons. It has a fantastic Riven disposition, one of the better Riven dispositions in the game, actually. So you can get some pretty huge base damage buffs on your Riven rolls, even if you're just, you know, casually rolling it yourself. Also, the way things are set up currently, weapons like this benefit from a lot of different bonus stats, right? The beam weapons are now pretty much all, or not all, but a lot of them, including this one, even with its low status chance, are good status weapons. It benefits a lot from status stats, it benefits a lot from crit stats, benefits a lot from direct damage, benefits a lot from multi-shot, benefits a lot from fire rate. You know, really any positive stat you can find, except for, like, I don't know, plus puncture damage, obviously. Not going to be the greatest. So anyway, that's kind of a side note, because that's kind of like a niche part of the community, right, that actually cares that much about Riven mods. I think. I don't really know. Anyway, so yeah, that pretty much covers these. I think the beam weapon rework is fantastic. I haven't used any beam weapons in a long time. I had 4 Forma on my Amprax from back in the day when it was a top tier weapon, but it hasn't really been in that category for, oh, I don't know, a year and a half, 2 years. So it's kind of nice to see any of these weapons besides maybe the Atomos getting any use. Or at least I hope they will get use, because they are very good. Although it may take a while before people catch on to just how much they've been buffed by these changes, because it really isn't clear just looking at the stats. I, for one, did not think a lot of them were going to be as good as they are now when I was reading over the patch notes. So, if you weren't expecting them to be that good, you are now free to be pleasantly surprised, as I was. They're actually pretty fantastic. All right, thank you all for watching. Yakri out.